I'm healing, and I can be healing and dying at the same time. It's a really magical, out-of-world, out-of-body experience. I know what my support system looks like, and I want to encourage you to develop your own, because this thing that we're experiencing can be very lonely, and it can also be very life-affirming in some ways. It does change us. We will never be the same, and that's not always such a bad thing. So find your support and don't isolate. And so I'm building new experiences around heartache, and I didn't know that I could do that. I didn't know grief would give me that opportunity, but it does.
Kris, I want to start off acknowledging you for putting this book together, sharing all you've been through this last number of years, which has been quite a lot. And the wisdom and stories are just going to be providing so much hope and inspiration and guidance for people. And I just want to acknowledge you right off the bat.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse.
So for somebody who feels like right now they're in the middle of a shitstorm and their life is coming down upon them and they don't really see the light at the end of the tunnel, as somebody who is, we're never truly out of it, and I'm sure we're going to get into that, for all of us, there's ebbs and flows to life. But for somebody that feels like they're in the middle of things right now and they don't feel that hope, after what you've been through, what guidance would you give them?
I would say commit to not abandoning yourself. Commit to not abandoning yourself, because when we're going through a very difficult time, sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes there's setbacks. Sometimes there's, lower points that you thought you were as low as you could go, and it turns out you could go lower. And so that commitment to yourself, to saying, I got you. I might not know how we're going to get through this, but I'm not going anywhere. And we're going to take it one step at a time, not even one day at a time, just one step at a time.
And then to get really practical on what that looks like, is that having an affirmation and looking at yourself in the mirror and actually saying that to yourself, thinking it, doing a meditation around that? Just want to get really granular on what that could look like.
I mean, I'll talk about what it looks like for me, and then I think it's very individual. So whatever it is that you do for yourself, that's your way of coming back home to yourself, coming back into your body, coming back into alignment, coming back to that present moment, coming back into that space where, you're really your own ally. It's going to look different for everybody, but for me, it usually happens through my journal. It happens when I take my end of day walks to just kind of like let it out. Even if that I only have 15 minutes, I can still do that and just sort of reconnect with my spirit. A lot of times we spend so much time in our heads. We're trying to figure things out. We're trying to strategize. We're trying to brainstorm. We make endless to-do lists. We figure out who we should call for help and all that. Or sometimes we don't do that because we're so overwhelmed. Maybe we just sit in paralysis. Both of these things are normal and natural. But being able to sort of like do whatever practices that you could do, just bring yourself back to that moment where you're like, okay, we're just going to touch our spirit for a minute here. We're so much bigger than these physical bodies. And when we're reminded of that, it's much easier to be in, as I said earlier, alignment. So for me, that could be going for my walk and saying, hey, I got you. How are you? I love you. Whew, what a day this has been. It could be the meditation practice. And for everybody, I suggest keep it simple. You don't need a lot of time. It's just more about that, whatever it is that sparks that connection. It could take 5 minutes. It could take 10 minutes, but you're doing that on a regular basis. So you, again, stay in alignment with yourself. And it could also be, as you beautifully said, affirmations. Before I go to the oncologist, oftentimes there's a story about this in the book. As you know, I'm in the waiting room and, you're going to feel some anxiety. My oncologist is going to tell me how things are. It's usually a good or a bad answer, and so you're flooded with anxiety. And so when I feel that feeling, that's the trigger for me. And I'll go to the bathroom and I'll just look in the mirror and I'll just say, I love you, Kris. You've got this. We've got this. And no matter what happens, no matter what he says, we're going to figure it out. And just soothing that nervous system, right? We're trying to find ways to get out of the fight or flight and back into that parasympathetic response, that rest and digest. because we can't make good decisions when we're in that fight or flight.
So you mentioned journaling, walking, affirmations. What are some other ideas for people when they need to use that as a tool in an acute case, like you mentioned, when you're going to get a diagnosis, or day to day, just to build that resiliency ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, for some people, it's movement. I think that's what's so powerful about movement. It's like it helps us change the channel. Sometimes we're just stuck at our desks, ruminating, trying to figure shit out. And just to get into your body and get out the door, do a 10-minute workout, something. Again, this is very personal. So these are just this is a menu of things that I'm sharing with you. But I think everybody's got to find the thing that helps them calm their nervous system. And a part of it too could be going to therapy. Like, I don't know, this last 4.5, 5 years when I recommitted to my therapy practice, I don't think I would have been able to write this book and feel the way I feel right now, and have not only navigated difficult times, but also strengthened certain relationships in my life if I didn't have somebody else to talk to. So depending on what's going in your life, what's the mental health wellness team that you can create? There's the things that we can do. And then there are the resources that, we may be able to invest in that could help us as well.
As I'm reading your book and conversing with you now, it gets me thinking about, and we're going to get into the details of what that period of time was like for you and the number of things that came down at once. But then to go within a relatively short period of time and then to relive and to write about it and then to share it with the public, did you find, what I'm getting at here is, did you find the writing process after you'd already lived it to be therapeutic for you, or what was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're only the second person that's asked me that question. I love this question, so thank you, Jesse. This book is called I'm Not a Morning Person, and it's the subtitle is Braving Loss, Grief, and the Big Messy Emotions That Happen When Life Falls Apart. And life falls apart for each and every one of us at various times to big and small degrees. This we know to be true. We can count on it. And yet few of us have the tools to navigate these storms. And so that's a lot about what I write about in the book, but also each chapter tells a different story, but it touches on a different emotion or experience that you may have as somebody who's going through a divorce, losing a loved one, getting a diagnosis, going through the miscarriage, losing your job. There's so many ways our lives can rupture. And so the creative process for me was it's how I process everything. That is my spiritual practice. And, that is probably the number one thing that I do to bring myself back into alignment. So when I was newly diagnosed 20 years ago, within 2 weeks, I turned on the camera. And that became my film, Crazy Sexy Cancer, and which I went on to sell, and it had a lot of critical acclaim. But I didn't do that at the time because I was like, I'm going to make a movie about it. I did what I did at the time because I am a creative human. And when the shit hits the fan, there's nothing healthier than being creative for me. So that will start with the journal, like where I'm really just like talking it out, telling the story of what's happening in my life with all the details, the tastes, the flavors, the way the air smelled, the time of year, the cool temperature, like you name it, I write it. And as I'm doing that, over time, it is the way I start to figure out not only what's going on, but who I am and how I want to show up during that time. So it's like I've done every time the rug gets pulled out from under me, I end up creating something because I was the one that needed it.
Well, it's interesting you talk about it from that therapeutic sense of being creative, but there's also, in my mind, a kick in the ass that happens when shit hits the fan, where we might do something more radical than we would do when we're in our day-to-day, quote-unquote, mundane life, like flipping on the camera and starting a documentary. It's interesting to think back 20 plus years and where your life would have went if you didn't get that diagnosis, and all the different opportunities and the way your life is gone because of that. And then again, not a microcosm, but another example of that is your father's passing. And I'm sure that's, been challenging beyond words, but it's probably motivated you to make changes in your own life and to do things that otherwise may have been left undone.
It's a beautiful way to say it. And it's so spot on. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like this before, but I feel like there's a reclamation that happens. There's a resurrection that has the possibility of happening. There's a renaissance in your life that can take place through difficult times. And every time that's happened to me, a difficult time has happened in my life. Maybe not every time, but several times I've had that experience. It's because of what you said. I think these ruptures rearrange us. That does not mean that I would choose this rupture. I would choose to not have cancer. I would choose to be sitting here with my dad. I would not choose this. It doesn't mean that I'm over it. It means that each day I'm moving through it. And the rearrangement that happens from rupture, again, just in my experience, is it brings your priorities into sharp relief. It might bring your values into better alignment. It could be that there's old dreams that you have let die because they weren't convenient or somebody else wasn't into them, or you thought it's too late for you to do those things, that you say, screw it. I am doing those things because my time here is finite and it's actually going to be shorter than I can possibly imagine. So why not get busy living? And that is where I find myself again, Jesse.
Well, hopefully a conversation like this and people tuning in can get a microcosm, we'll use that word again, of that from hearing your stories and hearing this conversation. Hopefully it can light the flame for people before they have to go through a major life-altering event. And again, it's not going to be the same. I don't want to belittle what happens when we go through these ruptures that we all go through in life. But sometimes just hearing about that and hearing the path that somebody took can be enough to get people moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think so. And sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay too, right? So in my work, a lot of people come to me and they're in one of two places. They've experienced a few warning signs, and usually health warning signs, and they're worried and they want to make some changes. Or they find themselves in a full-blown wake-up call. So warning sign, wake-up call. Either way, they're like, I want to take action. And if you are in this place of, oh, there have been some warning signs. My health isn't where I want it to be. My energy isn't where I want it to be. My physical discomfort, I've got some aches and pains, and, I feel like I'm too young for these feelings. That's not where I want to be. Or even more so, mental health warning signs. I'm struggling with prolonged anxiety. I'm struggling with depression. I'm really unhappy at work. My relationship, if I'm to be honest, it's not as fulfilling as it could be, right? To me, those are just as valid warning signs as your doctor told you your cholesterol is problematic, right? Those are just as valid warning signs because they affect our health, they affect our overall well-being, and they affect our joy. And if life is joyless, then I would say that's the biggest warning sign of all. I'm not saying that we're going to be happy all the time, but if more often than not we're in a joy drought, that's something to look at.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about these quote unquote more minor ruptures. It gets me thinking about, the 21st century and always connected and go, go, go. And I think they're easier than ever in this modern world to push off because we are so busy and connected, and grinding it out is so highly praised. And whereas, if life were a little bit more simple, maybe we would tune into them more and be able to act before we hit a full-blown rupture.
True. That's ideal. I mean, what you're painting is something for each and every one of us to aspire to. I think there's a lot of times that we run away from that simplicity as well. So if we know that we need more simplicity in our lives, that's one thing. But if we really think about, okay, what needs to happen to make that happen, sometimes it's really scary to do that work, because that means that there's constructs that more than likely will have to be deconstructed for that to happen, if that makes sense.
And the challenging thing is when we want to make a pivot in life or deconstruct something that's not working for us, because oftentimes we are so busy, it's easier just to push forward and stay on the current path.
Oh, yeah, without question. Without question. It sure is. It's difficult to unbusy busy. But if busy is the go-to, I talk about this a lot in my book. So, my go-tos, like I said, this book is called I'm Not a Morning Person. Well, what does that mean, actually? Well, for me, Jesse, it meant it's the one emotion that I really didn't want to go near. I didn't want to touch it. I felt very overwhelmed by it. I felt like if I went too close to it, it'd probably completely bring me under. I run my own business. I'm very supportive in my family. Like, I have a lot of responsibilities, just like you do, just like everybody else out there. And so I thought, well, if you spend time with grief, you can kiss all that shit goodbye, because you're going to fall apart. But that was obviously not true. And I've written a book about it, but I had to do a lot of work to even be willing to go near that emotion. And so I feel like the work that we have to do oftentimes starts with that realization that it's easy to bury ourselves in busy. It's easy to, for me, it comes from overworking. It comes from a sense of needing to be hypervigilant and, in control, which is all past trauma and wounds and wonderful things for me to explore in therapy. But I can use those things as avoidance mechanisms, and they're really good avoidance mechanisms. And then I add, I do something, positive in the world on top of that. And that just reinforces the avoidance mechanisms that I choose on a regular basis. Well, yeah, at least I'm putting something good out in the world. Yeah, that's another excuse.
And while you were pushing through and not addressing the grief in your life, were you realizing it at the time? Or was it only later on when shit hit the fan and you really needed to dig in and process that you realized you'd been pushing things off?
Yes and no. I'd say when we push things off, they come out in other ways, right? So for me, they would come out in the food choices I was making. They would come out in the alcohol I was drinking. They would come out, like, much earlier in my life, in drug use. They would come out in the unhealthy relationships that I chose. They come out in other ways. We can't, it's like physics, right? It's got to come out somehow. And it wasn't until I said, I want to approach this loss, this monumental loss of my father, in a different way, in a healthy way, in a way that honors him and honors me. And so, boy, is that brutal work. But it's also really fulfilling work.
Well, let's talk about what the first step was when you realized that this was going to be a different time of processing. You have this international business and you're a public figure, and there's, life isn't just going to pause for you to do this. So talk about having that realization, putting your flag in the ground and knowing that you're going to make a shift in the way that you're going to approach this. What do you do with the business stuff and all the other ongoings of your life to take the time to do this, quote unquote, right?
Well, I've never done something like this before. So I will say first and foremost that I made a lot of mistakes, but I was willing to make those mistakes. When my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, this is what was happening in my life at the time. I was coming off of a stage where I was doing a keynote for 3,000 people. And I was getting into the car and, getting to the plane, and then the plane is delayed. And I text my parents and I'm like, can I crash with you tonight? I'm going to be coming in pretty late, but I don't think I can make it all the way home. They live closer to the airport than where I lived at the time. And my mom said, sure. And I get to her house around midnight and the lights are on. So I'm like, something's fishy. And when I walked in and we said our hellos and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, she said, I don't know how to say this, but I'm just going to say it. Dad has a mass on his pancreas. And that was the moment that everything changed for me again. Again, we all have ruptures in our lives. This was probably one of, the top 3 ruptures of my life. Now, what was happening in my life at the time was things were busy, but they weren't like spinning out of control. But then his diagnosis, then the pandemic, then changes in my business that I chose to make because I wanted to have more time available to be a part of his final months, years, I didn't know. Then my own 20-year anniversary of living with stage 4 cancer. So it was this perfect storm in a way. And because of that, I chose to radically simplify my life. I chose to put certain business initiatives on hold. I chose to make less money, which means I had to lay some people off. I chose space because I needed it. I needed it for myself, but I also needed it because the one intention that I set is that I want to show up to this time fully. And so that was my experience. And obviously it's complicated. There's a lot of details and not everybody can make the same decisions that I made. And some people can make better decisions that I made, but that's what I chose to do. It's almost like when your life it was like a centrifugal force. Like you have to kind of stop it before you can start to turn it around. And in some ways, that's what I did.
And when you began to do that, I'm sure there was a lot of fear coming up because, you're making these big changes and slowing down inertia that had been building for years. If that is the case, did a lot of those fears come true, or was it more of a smooth transition than you would have anticipated?
There was nothing smooth about it. I think what I did was just say, I don't know what I'm doing. I've not done this before. And I'm willing to make mistakes. And, but I'm going to stay true to my intention, which is I'm going to show up for myself and I'm going to show up for my family.
And when I say what I was getting at there was more the business aspect. Obviously, there's nothing smooth about somebody that we love leaving this planet. But when it comes to the business, because you are such a go-getter and somebody that has put so much effort in that area and built up this brand in yourself, it would have to be hard to slow things down and to, again, lay people off and to change that up, to take this time to be with family during this traumatic time for you guys.
Yeah, that was the part I was referencing. That was not smooth. And that was the area that I said I'm willing to make mistakes. And, I'm not always going to make the right decision. And some decisions that I made actually ended up being better decisions for the business over the long haul. And other decisions, I would say, if I could go back, I would do it differently, but you can't. So as I often say, because I have a few clients that I coach with wellness businesses, I often say, with people who maybe had a difficult time during the pandemic with their businesses, and some people did really well, some people did not. And I say, well, here's the thing. None of us in this room know or knew how to navigate a global pandemic. So, we all have to cut ourselves some slack. When the shit hits the fan, we're not going to have all the answers, whether it's in your business, whether it's in your life, whether it's in your relationships. It's just honestly, for me, about setting that intention. How do I want to approach this so that as I move through this, I do my best to stay as connected, as well, as intact as I can, mentally, emotionally, and physically.
And when it comes to the ruptures, it's almost like I can see it in different stages. One being knowing that as a human being, we're going to have these ruptures and these ebbs and flows to life, and to become as resilient and healthy as we can before they come up. And then, no matter how prepared we are, handling it the best we can through that experience. And we could kind of take each of those and talk about them separately. And we got into the walking, the journaling, the affirmations. But as somebody who inevitably is going to encounter multiple ruptures as a human being, what are some of the things that you'd tell somebody to build that resilience? It's not going to even come close to making them immune when they come up, but to feel as in control and as strong as possible when life inevitably shit hits the fan in life.
Yeah. I have a whole chapter in the book that's called Self-Care in the Storm. And I kind of feel like everybody should practice that chapter every day, regardless if there's a storm or not, you know. So what I teach in my wellness community, and I have an online membership, and I teach what I call the 5 pillars of wellness. And that's being mindful, not perfect, but being mindful about optimizing what you're eating, what you're drinking, what you're thinking, and how you're resting and renewing. When we're going through a difficult time, we're usually pulled in a million different directions. So we may not always have a lot of time to give to our self-care. But if we can think about those pillars, being mindful of what I'm eating, well, let's say I don't have time to make a beautiful plant-based meal, which is the practice that I teach and practice myself. Can I make a smoothie? Maybe I'm going through such a rough time that not only do I not have the time, I don't really have an appetite. You know, sometimes we have a big appetite when we're in a place of anxiety and fear. Sometimes we have no appetite, but we know we need nourishment, and we know we need real food, food that's going to fuel us. And so, can I make a healthy smoothie? Can I drink water? Right? Let's say you're somewhere where you can't get any of the things that you know are going to help you feel better when I'm talking about food choices. Well, can I stay hydrated? Because when I'm dehydrated, brain fog, lack of energy, sluggish bowels, of course, that affects our immune system, right? So these are simple things. Can I just make sure I'm getting my water? Put a pitcher by your desk and sip it throughout the day, or whatever you need to do. Thinking, we talked about that. So when I find myself going into these fearful places, oh, this is what my brain does. This is called anxiety. Of course, I'm feeling it right now. What do I need to do to kind of bring myself back into alignment? Well, those fear-based thoughts that I'm ruminating about, you know, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And oh my gosh, and all of a sudden I'm telling myself I'm someplace else. I'm telling myself really scary stories. Can I notice that? Take a deep breath and come back to this moment where I can feel my butt on the ground, my bare feet on the floor, under this desk. You know, what can I do to sort of go like, okay, I'm not in that fearful fantasy. I am right here. And right here, I am safe. Right here, I am hanging out with my new friend, Jessie. Right here, I'm okay. So again, eating, drinking, thinking, resting. Can I make sure I'm prioritizing my sleep? And renewing. Renewing has 2 parts, and that's movement and joy. So movement, we know movement changes everything. It helps our energy. It helps our immunity. It helps our mental health. Again, 10 minutes a day of just a joy bath through movement. And then making sure we're doing the things that, like, I love hummingbirds, Jessie. So before this interview, I went cleaned all my feeders. I fed my birds. They all know me. So they all come around. They're so excited. They're so chirpy. My husband said, it's the one thing you never blow off. Like, no matter what, those hummingbirds are going to get care from you. And it's because they give me so much joy. So these things are small. I'm not telling you to hack your body. I'm not saying you need to hop on the latest diet trend. I'm not suggesting you do anything other than simple self-care practices that will help to keep that well full, halfway full, whatever. So that if you're going through a stressful time, you are, in your words, able to maybe be a little bit more resilient with your well-being, because there's nothing worse than when we're going through a difficult time and our health craps out at the same time too. That's a lot to navigate.
Well, as somebody is going through a period where they're, going through a rupture, it's going to be a lot more challenging to maintain that wellness routine naturally with, the emotions and the stress and the anxiety, all the things that are going to come up. As somebody that's recently been through a lot of that, somebody tuning in today saying, I have this other person in my life that I really care about, and I see they're going through something like that. Oftentimes, I know from my experience, and you talk about this in the book, we don't really know how to handle that as a supporting person. So say, we can come up with a hypothetical situation. Somebody in my life, a good friend, is having a rupture and they're going through a divorce. How do we navigate being there as a supportive person in their life, but also giving them the space they need to process and move through that?
Yeah. I want to go back for a minute because you said something that made me feel like I want to clarify for folks out there. When I talk about the pillars and talk about basic self-care, I'm not suggesting you have to do all of these things at once, right? And so these are just the pillars, the categories that I'm suggesting we stay mindful around. Like we know if we eat 3 meals a day, we're having 21 meals a week, right? So what I'm suggesting is make some different choices if it's that healthy smoothie. As opposed, I don't want anybody watching this walking away feeling like now they have a laundry list of self-care and they want to, they're frustrated. It's like we're already doing a lot of these things. So can we be mindful about optimizing them? We know we're going to hopefully sleep. So can we be mindful about maybe tucking ourselves in and winding down a little earlier so that we get more sleep than staying addicted to the phone or watching news? Because hey, it can be in some ways soothing to tap into the ship pickle du jour, but ultimately it creates more stress in our bodies and in our psyches. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. I'm a big fan. My motto is turtle power. So I'm a slow and steady wins the race type gal. A friend of mine said to me the other day, he said, I marvel at how much you get done at a slow and steady pace compared to what I get done at a pace that feels like, I'm moving at warp speed. And I was like, well, I don't know if that's true, but that is a very big compliment because it is my mantra, turtle power. When we're going through a difficult time, I have a chapter in the book called Awkward Times, Awkward People. And that those awkward people also mean us, and that awkward person has been me and probably will be me again in the future because I am not an enlightened being by any sense of the word. But I think it's easy for us to say a bunch of things or do a bunch of things that can oftentimes have a different impact than what you intended, right? So I remember when one of my dogs passed and I was going through a really rough time for quite some time. And somebody said to me, but it's just a dog, right? Well, that dog is my child, right? Or, when I was newly diagnosed, oh, wow, a friend of mine had that cancer and she died, right? So the person saying that, you might not be conscious, like, oh, wow, that's going to hit somebody pretty hard. That's not soothing, Or you're young, you'll have another baby. I wanted that baby. There's so many other fish in the sea. I don't want fish. I want my person. These are not things that people say because they want to harm you or hurt you. We say them because we don't know what to say. So sometimes we put words together that probably shouldn't go together. And so what I always suggest, and this is something I try to practice myself, but I don't always do it well, is courageous acknowledgement. Because more often than not, when we're going through difficult times, we feel lonely. We feel like we don't know from up from down, and we are so flooded with decisions and overwhelm and sadness and all of the other emotions that come with it, that when somebody acknowledges, I am so sorry for your loss. I am so sorry you're going through this breakup. I am so sorry you got fired. That must really hurt. When somebody acknowledges it, it just feels like you are back in the land of the living, that you're not invisible, that you have somebody on your team who can see you. And the next thing besides just being courageous about acknowledging it is listening more than we talk, because there's nothing we can say to make it better. But what we can do is be a shoulder. What we can do is set an intention again for how we want to show up. Instead of, one of the things I know I've said many times, and I know people have said to me, is, hey, let me know if you need something. I've said that. But I'm also going to tell you, I ain't going to tell you if I need something. I'm not reaching out to you to tell you that I need something. I'm not. Just like you're not going to reach out to me. And so it's like a good intention kind of gone wrong, because it makes us feel like we said something, and that we can kind of get it off our plate. But what I've seen more often than not is what's more helpful is to say, I'm going to the store today. Give me a list. I'm happy to drop things off. Hey, I made an extra lasagna. I'm going to leave it on your doorstep. You don't even have to say hello to me. I'll just text you when I'm out front. If you're not close proximity, I'm not suggesting you fly 3,000 miles to drop off a lasagna. But often the people that we're the closest to might be in closer proximity. And so how can we show up in ways that we're actually offering support as opposed to you let me know?
As you share all this, it's interesting to think why this is so taboo to talk about and why it is so uncomfortable and why we don't know how to do such a basic thing, because these ruptures, again, are going to happen to all of us at different points in our lives. And to me, it must come down just to the fact that there's this discomfort in having conversations like this and bringing it to the forefront, because when you do, you really realize that it's not anything we need to be uncomfortable about. And it's really simple, the best way to support people. But I know from experiences in my life, it's just, it is really awkward when you go to a funeral and you don't know what to say and how much to bring up about the person's past and stories. And it's uncharted waters. And that's why conversations like this, I think, are just so helpful.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I feel like part of that courageous acknowledgement is saying, hey, buddy, I love you. You're in my inner circle heart, and I'm probably going to say weird things at times, and I'm sorry, and I don't know how to do this, but I am so on board for our friendship and whatever it is that, you need. And I'm going to just keep showing up. And so, or the example of like a memory, which is so beautiful. Oftentimes we want to keep talking about our loved ones. What happens many times is the funeral ends and there's all this attention beforehand because the person died. Funerals happen quickly, oftentimes different during COVID times, or the height of COVID rather. But there's a lot of energy going in one direction. And then afterwards, you're still in the land of mourning and loss and grieving and all the other emotions that go with grieving that can sneak up on you. But everybody else has moved on. And sometimes there's pressure for you to move on too. Oh, you're still upset about that? Yeah. So I love this conversation about memories specifically because I love it when I learn new stories about my dad or other people that I've lost that I never knew. And it's so wonderful to hear those stories because we get to relive times with them and learn more about them. Like my uncle shared with my mom the other day, I was very close to my grandmother about my grandmother used to smoke cigars in her sewing room. And I was like, what? Grandma smokes cigars in her sewing room? And I thought that was just the funniest. I mean, she lived long into her 90s. And I was just like, I just thought that was a pretty funny memory, something I never knew about. And so if you don't know if it's okay to share, obviously you don't want to share the crappy memories, but, like, hey, I have a beautiful story about your sister. Would you like to hear it?
When you talked about this rupture of your dad getting his diagnosis and you decided you were going to change things up in your own world and be there for him and support him through the process of his passing, and that was a number of years, it sounds like from reading your book and talking to you to this point that he was supportive of that. But we all have different family dynamics and different relationships with so many different people in our world. So what I'm getting at here is, how do we respond when family might not be as receptive of wanting us around and our help? And maybe it's just because of, maybe it's not even their true willingness and what they really want, but they don't know how to accept what you're trying to offer. And I can imagine, and there's so many different relationships. Like when you decide you're going to do that, you have your team that you're working with, your husband, your mom, your dad. There's so many different dynamics, and how do we navigate all that?
Because you said there's so many different dynamics, it's very personal, and I'm certainly not a therapist, so I don't give any counsel on that one. But I do go back to this idea that it's helpful to have a therapist. Especially if you're going through a big transition or change as a family. Like many of us are now entering chapters of our lives where we are dealing with elderly parents, right? And the needs that they have emotionally, physically, their safety, a lot of the dynamics change. But we're still sovereign citizens. We have our own likes, we have our desires, we have our own preferences. We can't force people to do the things that we want them to do, regardless of whether or not we think they're the wiser choice. But in some cases, especially as you think about elder care, there are situations where support may be needed in a way that your person is not on board for yet. And so that's when counselors, that's when therapists, that's when, even resources that you can maybe find through hospitals, through social workers, through care.com can be helpful because we're navigating an aging population and all of the changes that come with that. And we as children specifically, we need support to make sure we are as respectful as possible, while also helping the people in our lives who are aging continue to still live their best life, right? For some people, it could be that, my father wants to stay in his house and we have the ability to make that happen. And that's where he wants to die. And we have the ability to make that happen. So we are going to make that commitment and we're going to get the care needed so that he's safe. Other people may not have that opportunity. So what are the options? We have to understand what they are first and foremost.
And Kris, for you, when your father got this diagnosis, it would obviously be a huge rupture for anybody, but it ties back to what you shared earlier, your story and being diagnosed yourself with stage 4 cancer almost 20 years before. So what I'm curious, because of that dynamic and that tie to your personal story, what did that open up for you with, your cancer journey and reopening up possibly some trauma around that.
Yeah, I'd say you hit the word, trauma with a big T. The early days of my diagnosis, we didn't know how fast it was. We didn't know if it was slow growing. There's no cure for the disease that I have. And so it's a sarcoma, which is in soft tissue. And my particular disease presents in different ways. It can be aggressive. It can be slow growing and become aggressive. It can be slow growing and stay slow growing your whole life, which also includes pretty much being stable or indolent. And I, for the last 20 years, have had the stable, indolent variety. It's given me the opportunity to learn how to take care of myself, to write a whole lot about that process, to write about prevention and disease recovery and all the things that I've been doing for the last 20 years. But that could also change, right? So I go and I get my tests every 5 years and sort of see where I am and then negotiate when I come back. Usually I try to get more time in between scans. But in the beginning of my disease and throughout my disease, there have been moments where it was very terrifying. Not knowing how long I had to live, not having the right doctor at first. And the first doctor I spoke to suggested a triple organ transplant. I wouldn't be here if that happened. The second doctor gave me 10 years to live and radical treatment options that would basically do nothing, but I felt scared not to do treatment because you think it's stage 4 cancer, I should do treatment. I have to do treatment. If I had any other disease, I think it would be a different conversation, because sometimes with advanced cancers, it's like very important to do treatment in my estimates, because you have the opportunity to slow things down, and figure out what to do. So, and even be cured, right? But anyway, so there was moments like that. And then there was also decisions that we had to make along the way, like deciding not to have our own biological children, because my disease has been slow growing. And so one of the things that my oncologist said was, I'm not going to suggest no. I'm not going to say that, this is what you really want to do, but I want you to imagine your disease like a rock that's balancing on the top of a mountain. If that rock starts to tumble, right, because of something like the hormones from a pregnancy, and again, not a lot known about my disease at the time, I might be able to stop it, but I can't ever put it back on top of the mountain. So that's a risk you need to think about as you make this decision. And year after year, we'd go back and see if there had been any advancements in treatment options and whether we should make the choice to have a child or not. And ultimately, there weren't advances. And ultimately, I wasn't willing to put myself or a child through that. And so there's trauma that happens as a result of these experiences. Even though I live a healthy life, yes, with stage 4 cancer, I have a very beautiful life in many ways, but those things are still real, and those things live in my body and live in my psyche and live in ways in my body that if I'm not conscious of them, our bodies start to break down. Our well-being starts to break down. It's like the beautiful book, and all of Gabor Mate's work, where he talks about trauma and talks about trauma in the body, but also the beautiful book, The Body Keeps Score. Trauma, as Gabor says, is not something that happened to you. It's something that happened inside of you. And for me, it was just, for whatever reason, when he got diagnosed, it all came back in ways that I wasn't prepared to experience. And then, other things, because again, we have big lives. A lot of stuff goes down, good and not so good. And so that has been and continues to be a part of my wellness practice, is to, the psychologist Carl Jung says we go through the same themes throughout our life, and we orbit through them, and with each orbit, we pass a new level of meaning. And from where I stand, as I write in the book, it's that orbiting that is the mechanism of our healing. And we may not be cured. I may never be cured, but it's through that orbiting. And and through the intention and through that commitment, I'm healing. And I can be healing and dying at the same time. It's a really magical out of body experience.
Well, you share in the book this epiphany you had along your cancer journey when you made the shift from trying to cure yourself to healing and changing the North Star of your healing journey. So I'll have you talk about that.
Yeah. So for the longest time, I wouldn't think that I should even bother to talk to somebody like you, because who would want to talk to me if I still have cancer? Like, I don't have the victorious hero's journey story. Like, she got sick. She drank green juice. She got well. Let's book her on our show. You know what I mean? And it's just not the way it works for a lot of people. And I think we live in a very binary world. It's either black or white, where we win our battle or we lose our battle. So we're winners or we're losers. Well, there's a lot of people that fall into the gray. So what are we? I remember I called my second book, it was Crazy Sexy Cancer Survivor, More Rebellion and Fire for Your Healing Journey. And because at the time I called myself a cancer survivor, everybody came up to me and said, "You did it. You beat it. Yeah, you're a hero." And I was like, wait a minute. Did you not read my story? Have you not? I've just been on the stage doing a keynote for the last hour. But people have a hard time seeing somebody who looks well and saying, "Nah, she can't have it." Right. And then I decided I'm confusing people by calling myself a survivor, even though at the time that was a very appropriate word, and I wanted to use it because I wanted to be a survivor, and Lord knows I was paying taxes, and I still do. So in my mind, who's surviving, right? I'm still doing all the stuff that everybody else has to do. But then I thought, just maybe I'm going to start to call myself a cancer thriver, not because I feel like I need to define myself, but because the work that I do is public. So I like to, be as unconfusing as possible, and also highlight a different way of living that includes people like me that don't have a story that's done or over or in the past, that may never be in my case, just specifically speaking of cancer, I may never be in remission. And so this idea that I couldn't put my work out into the world unless I had that victorious story held me back for quite some time. And here I am learning so many important things that I wanted to share with people, specifically patients at the time. But I was holding myself back because I felt like a failure. Especially in the wellness world, I don't know, there can be a lot of pressure, and I didn't feel like I was good enough. And so, but then at the 10-year mark, I did it anyway, by the way, Jesse, obviously I've been doing this 20 years, but it was a nagging feeling inside, like I'm a phony. And then at the 10-year mark, I said, screw this. Oh my gosh, you have so much to teach about fortitude and resilience and going the distance with something you may not want, but here you are, and you can still have a beautiful life anyway. And you speak from the trenches of it. And I said, if I spend my whole life trying to cure myself, even if I tell people I'm not, but secretly inside, I'm like, what's the latest thing? Should I go do that thing in Austria? You know what I mean? Like, if I'm still being driven by that, it feels like I'm wasting my life. It's like, whoa, in this moment, my life isn't good enough. And that's when I said, no. It didn't mean I stopped taking care of myself. It just meant that I stopped doing it for cancer or for some medal. I started doing it for Kris. And that actually created not only created more joy, but more, inspiration inside of me to do it. Because you never want to do stuff when you're feeling forced to do it.
And something from your book that ties in with that part of your story is acceptance. The fact that you reached a point in your cancer journey where, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it from your book is where you accepted that you're going to live with cancer. It wasn't about getting to this point of being cured and being tumor-free, embracing what it is and not giving up. An important caveat there, still continuing to strive and to treat yourself well and to do all you can, but accept that piece of the story.
Yeah. It took a lot of redefining because I also write, and you remember because you read the book, and thank you for doing that. I appreciate you. I remember I was giving a keynote, and it was about the power of acceptance, and big conference that I was doing. And one of the other speakers backstage in the green room said, "You're going to talk about the power of acceptance?" I'm like, "Yeah." Talked a little bit about my talk, and I'm about to go on, by the way, and then she goes, "Oh, so you teach people to give up." And I was like, this is exactly why I need to talk about this word, and why I wrote a whole chapter about it, because I think acceptance gets a bad rap. It's not about lowering your standards. It's not about giving up. It's not about, a lot of the things that we can associate with acceptance. It's about owning your self-worth. It's about what I said with my very first answer, which is not abandoning yourself, especially in your time of need. It's about doing it for you. It's about saying, yes, this may be the situation I find myself in, but that doesn't mean that I am not worthy of love and respect and care. I accept that I have cancer, and I accept that I am going to live my life fully anyway. I accept that there may be some limitations that I have as a result of maybe certain choices that I've made in my life, or certain business decisions that I made in this season. I accept that. And I know that there's more where that came from, that prosperity is around the corner for me, right? And so I feel like acceptance just helps us to get grounded with where we are right now, not from a place of beating ourselves up, not from a place of lack, but from a place of, hey, I'm going to get super sober. This is where I am right now. Because if I don't get sober about where I am right now, how am I going to get where I want to go? And if I can't get exactly where I want to go, can I be flexible? Can I still have the life that I vision for myself with cancer? Yeah, I can, but only I can make that choice.
And Kris, do you remember along your cancer journey when you had that moment of acceptance that you were going to continue to live with cancer and thrive, and what that did for you?
Yes, I was disappointed. I was at my 10-year mark, and I was disappointed that I wasn't healed. Healed, because I thought healed and cured were the same thing. And that was the moment that I said, you're going to waste your life. What if you live to 96 and you're disappointed? You're disappointed because you couldn't put a nice little bow on it. And I said, what a waste. How many weeks do we live on average as human beings? Well, depending on our age span, if we live our full age span, it's something like 4,000 weeks and change. It's shocking. So do I want to spend any time in this place of, well, it's not good enough unless the doctor says, puts a stamp on the paper? So that was the turning point for me, because everybody else was happy but me. And I said, something's got to change here. This is ridiculous.
And as somebody that's had their own cancer diagnosis, 20 years ago now, and, your father going through cancer and being diagnosed and eventually is passing, how have those experiences changed the way that you look at death?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, they're different for me and for him. So I'll start with being with a loved one. And I think many people out there listening have probably experienced that or will experience that in the future. And I mean, like, actually being there at the time of their death and beyond. I took his lead because sometimes a person wants to talk about it. As you said earlier, everybody's family dynamic is different. Some people will be open, some people won't be. And the point is to be with where they are. I often say the only time you can change somebody is when they're in diapers. But boy, do we try. No, it's my way. I know best. Eat your vegetables. But with my father, I was really like taking the lead from him, and I knew that he wanted to talk about it. And I also learned through our relationship that at times he felt very lonely because there were only a few people that he felt comfortable talking to about his experience. Of course, my mother was one of them. And so I was terrified to have a conversation with him about death. But at this point, he was in the hospice phase. His time was weeks, months, maybe, if we were lucky. And, you couldn't avoid the elephant in the room because physically he was changing very rapidly. And so new obstacles are presented on a regular basis. And I said to my therapist, I know that my dad wants to talk about this, but I don't know what to do. And I'm afraid to get it wrong. How do I start this? And she said, why don't you start by talking about it? So you don't hit it head on, but you kind of have like a little pregame huddle. And so I did. I was like, Dad, I'd like to talk to you about talking about it. I want you to know that I love you. I'm here for it. I'm going to cry. I'm going to need tissues. I may say the wrong things, but I do want to show up if this would be appealing to you. And he said, absolutely. And that's when he told me that it can be really lonely. And he shared things like, I don't know how many goals to make. He was setting goals for mental goals for himself, physical goals for himself, little tiny things for 4 years. But then as you get closer and closer and closer to the end, it's like, what do I set? And then at some point, it's not about setting any goals. It's just about being in the truth of where you are, which is beautiful to watch him go from setting those goals to just loving, himself, the people he got to spend time with. It was like a spiritual life class, Jesse.
Well, as you share that, talking about death with a loved one as they're, at the end of their life, it brought up for me the fact that there's 2 layers to that. For someone like you in the position of being the person who's not passing, the fact that a lot of us don't even think about our own death or death in general. And so there's that whole layer of processing and thinking about it. And then the layer with another individual. So it's almost like you need to do your own work, which probably a lot of us haven't done, to think about death and not push that away day in, day out, and then to be able to bring that conversation to another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that that's true. And it happens in stages and phases, I did a lot of work for a long time about the idea of my physical body and, basically my time on earth and physical body coming to an end, and when you're newly diagnosed or you're living with cancer, it can be an unavoidable experience to, just an unavoidable experience to think about because, you have a reminder of it every day. But I'd say, it's scary at first, and then it can be very aligning, not to come back to that word, but if we only have so much time, how are we going to use it? What matters, what doesn't? If we only have so much energy, where do we want to put it? Who do we want to spend it with? And we can't have our way all the time, right? There's people I spend time with that, hey, it's part of my job. I might not choose to spend time with all the people that I spend time with, but more often than not, are we being intentional with how we're spending our energy and how we're spending our time? And I think every single one of us, as you just so beautifully said, we will all 100% benefit from asking ourselves those questions and getting to the heart of the answers and realizing how many weeks you have left. Like I was given a terminal diagnosis with an expiration date. I have outlived that expiration date, but I will expire, and so will you. We don't know when, but we know it's coming. And so it's scary. It's not to say there aren't tears and depression and sadness and, a period of being freaked out. But when we can breathe through that and then start to really ask ourselves those questions and answer them and maybe make some changes accordingly, month from now, you may find yourself in a different place. A year from now, you may find yourself in a richer place. 5 years from now, you may find yourself completely transformed.
And this ties back to something we talked about early in the conversation, the fact that these ruptures can be catalyst to living a better life. And you mentioned you would never wish cancer upon yourself, which of course makes sense. But the fact that you have in a way had to look at death so closely, it's probably brought in a lot of gifts to you along your journey. The silver lining within, and again, I'm not making light of the diagnosis in the situation, but it's brought in a lot of, it's forced you to look at death, and that, I think for all of us, when we do that, it brings us back to the present and gets us sweating the small stuff less and gets us focused on what really matters.
Yeah. And we're going to sweat the small stuff because we're human beings. That's what it is. So it's just about kind of remembering and coming back and not getting swept away by the small stuff. I think we get so scared and we come undone, and we have to go all the way back to our DNA. Why don't we want to talk about these things? Why do we avoid these things? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, we survive in numbers, right? You don't want to be the lone wolf out there. You don't want to be the one who's cast out of the village because you got all the big emotions. You know what I mean? So there's reasons why we evolved to avoid certain feelings. And there's reasons why we have fear and anxiety. And from an evolutionary perspective, that's also part of how we survived. Be afraid of that snake. Don't eat that berry. If I do this, is this going to happen? Because last time it did, right? So we start to ruminate about that. All those things are why we're here now. So that's why I say in the book, we can't amputate any of our emotions and expect to be whole. We can't. I think the number one thing it's given me, if I could to distill it down, is a fierce, fierce friendship with myself. Where in past years and in different chapters of my life, I didn't have that. I would care more about what you think about me than what I thought about me. And most of the things I thought about me were not very kind. And so I put my self-worth into the relationship du jour, into the way my career was going, into the way I looked, and all these different places that we can put our pain. And if looking at my mortality and making very conscious decisions, knowing that I have a condition that may or may not be what ends my time here, that inspiration to say, well, you know what? I got you. I got your back. You can count on me. That fierce friendship, which helps me in business, which helps me in relationships, which helps me when I get really bad news, which helps me when somebody hurts my feelings, which helps me throughout big decisions that I have to make in my life, decisions that might impact other people too. Because it's easy to make decisions to please others and not please yourself. But if I come to the table every day with like, hey, first and foremost, it's going to be about what it is that gives me joy and feels good in my system. And it's a whole different life. Now, am I always good at that? No, this is a practice. But that fierce, radical friendship with self, it's a North Star. It helps you make those decisions that allow you to stay connected to your soul, your spirit, what you're doing and here to do in this life, as opposed to what everybody else is doing and comparing to yourselves to them and falling short.
And where along your journey did forming that relationship become a priority specifically? And then for somebody that feels like that's totally foreign to them and they're feeling like you did before, where you're, people pleasing and on that you shared, how do they begin to do that work?
That's a big question. So where did it happen? I remember one time, and it's not always through the cancer lens that I learned this, but for the purpose of this conversation, these are some great memories that came up as you asked these wonderful questions that you're asking. I remember being in the CAT scan room and, they put the vest on you and I've got all these needles in me, and I got the contrast and all the stuff that's happening, and they're checking to see, have the tumors grown, what's going on, let's look under the hood. And they put the big vest on you because of the radiation. And then everybody runs out of the room. The technicians are behind glass. The person that's the nurse is, behind the glass. And then it's you. And it was in those moments where everybody else skittled out of the room, and it was just me with that heavy radiation vest on myself. And I was like, girl, I got you. I ain't going to skittle out of this room. Here we are. And I think that I even remember laughing to myself and saying it because I felt so alone. It was like, it's a dangerous room to be in. And even saying that started the process of talking to myself. And sometimes I go for a walk at the end of the day, and I talk to myself, and my neighbors know. They either think I'm nuts. There's the crazy blonde lady that talks to herself and walks every day. Or maybe they're like, she knows exactly what she's doing. She's going on a walk with herself. But that was the moment that I laughed, and the moment that I think that the fierce friendship started. Or one of the moments where I remember it clearly. And how do you start it? I think we can talk about all the different practices. We've talked about some of them. Everybody's got their own unique way of saying, I want to be friends with you. What does this friendship need to look like for it to be satisfying? Only you can answer that question. But we can decide I'm going to actually ask the questions. How many of us even ask ourselves that question? And I'd say where it really begins is the willingness. So I don't care how you do it. That's up to you. The only thing you need to focus on right now is, are you willing? Are you willing to have a radical friendship with yourself? And if the answer is yes, you ask yourself, what's the first step? Because I can't answer that for anybody. I know what it is for me. But ask yourself if you're willing first. And if you're not willing right now, that's okay. It's totally okay. You could ask yourself, are you willing to have a friendship with me someday? Maybe you would say yes to that question. And that's enough for that moment.
It sounds like just being aware for now is enough. That is a possibility.
Yeah, but it's not a possibility if you don't start the dialogue. And to your point, it all starts with that awareness.
One of the things you share in the book is that towards the end of your dad's life, he would share these nuggets with you of wisdom. And one of my favorite ones that sticks out to me reading the book is to live your golden years now. And this ties back to the death thing and life being short and a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. But I think this is so applicable for all of us. The fact that it's so easy to get caught up in the go, like we talked about earlier, of today's world and striving for more and getting caught up in the busy life and the connection to everything. But life is short, and there's no reason to wait. And it sounds cliche, but this I really want to get into this with you because it is so profound, and I think it can be so life-changing for people. Not to wait till later in life to really start living.
Yeah, look, cliche things are great. We've just become snarky people that label things cliche things, right? I know if I say that to myself, I'll be like, oh, that's so cliche. And I'll be like, shut up. It's true. Don't judge it. And so I laugh that you use that word because I actually say that to myself. And that's when I know I'm not in good friendship. That's when I have to come back. So my dad, it was a couple of summers before he died, and we had made the commitment to do fun things together. And so as he got closer to death, the fun thing would be like playing gin rummy. But while he was still well enough to travel, we would travel for his birthday, for my birthday. We'd go someplace that we wanted to see, we wanted to experience, but maybe we didn't because, as you said, life was so busy. We didn't get on planes and stuff because his immune system was too compromised, but like where were the places in the tri-state area? You know, I live in Connecticut, and then I lived in New York that we could go to. And one of the places that we went to towards the end was Martha's Vineyard, which is a beautiful little island. And I found this idyllic restaurant at the point of the island, this beautiful view, golden hour, this shimmer on the water, and it was just lovely. And of course, I say in the book, the recovering perfectionist in me was very pleased because I wanted everything to be perfect, everything to be right. I wanted to control the entire experience. And if it wasn't perfect, boy, did I feel bad about it. I learned how to let that go. But at the time, I was still in that place. And he raised his glass and he gave a toast and he said, you know, I've worked my whole life and I thought I was going to retire and then I'd be able to do a lot more of these types of things. And I didn't do a lot of these things along the way because I own my own business and summers are my busy season. And so I didn't prioritize these things. But now I'm retiring and I have terminal pancreatic cancer. And so he said, you have to make your golden years now. You have to make your golden years now because they might just be now. And so figure out what your more like this experience that we were having in that moment is, and do it sooner. And so that idea of making our golden years now has stuck with me, obviously, and will always stick with me. It's a beautiful metaphor and a beautiful compass that we can follow.
I love it. And part of what I got thinking as you were sharing that is the fact that we don't necessarily need these big over-the-top moments to live what you're talking about here. It's nice to have them in the mix where we're overlooking the water at a fancy restaurant, but it can be cuddling with our partner, watching a good movie on a Saturday night. It's just being aware and enjoying the essence of that moment, whatever it is.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's the small moments that make up our lives. It is the small moments day in and day out that make up the vast majority of our lives. I would love to go to the Serengeti. I want to see a lion that isn't in a cage at a zoo somewhere. I would love to have those experiences. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But it is the small moments that make up the quality of our life. And I think, if anything, you know, watching my dad in the last 4 years, he may not have had a lot of golden years, which he thought, oh, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if I have this other bright chapter where I can play golf with my brother who's also retired and do these things that I had thought I would be doing in my retirement and so forth. But in those 4 years, he lived them in a golden way. Through the pain, through the suffering, through the physical challenges, I saw his heart grow and swell and break open. And I saw so much love and so much forgiveness, self-forgiveness, you know, that it was beautiful to witness. So sure, we went places, but it was in those small moments of golden living that I watched him transform. So it may not be about quantity of time, but it is about that intentional quality. Like you beautifully said, cuddling with the person you love. If I had to choose between that and some big, fantastic experience in Paris, I would choose the cuddling.
Well, to highlight the essence of what we're getting at here, there's two different layers. It's not to chase these big extravagant moments necessarily, and also not to wait till later in life to have them. So two different layers to it. But I also want to add, and I touched on this earlier, still enjoy if you can get to Africa and see a lion out in the wild. Like, don't have those moments. It's having them in the mix, but enjoying whatever it is, whether it's this conversation or, again, the cuddling on the couch with your partner. It's all beautiful if you have that right mindset and you're fully in that moment.
100%. And back to what we have been touching on is it's individual. Somebody listening to this could be like, I want big moments all the time. Otherwise, I don't feel like I'm living. If that's you, that's you. You know, somebody else may be like, I want things to look forward to along the way. Great. As you just so beautifully said, start building them in. Oh, but I can't possibly start building them in.
You touched on something a couple minutes back about this evolution of your dad at the later part of his life. I think you said self-acceptance. Talk about some of that in greater detail, some of the transformation that happened in him that we can get nuggets from and maybe change our path without facing death. Because obviously that's going to get us thinking about life differently and really changing our whole perspective. When, you know, talking about death, thinking about death is one thing, like we talked about, but then when it is right there and you know it's inevitable, it's going to be a whole nother layer to that. So talk about some of that stuff your dad was able to let go and that transformation he was able to make so we can garner from the wisdom there.
Yeah. I talk about this a lot in the book, including a big chapter on spirituality. But one of the things it just brings me back to is that radical friendship with self. Because specifically for him, being willing to ask for help, he was not the type of person that asked for help. He was the type of person that gave help, but receiving help was very difficult. But at some point, you're in a position where you can't do things for yourself, right? With where he was in his health and with his trajectory of terminal pancreatic cancer. Can't bathe yourself. You can't feed yourself. You can't get to yourself to the bathroom by yourself. These are all very basic things that we're used to having complete free. Many of us, not all of us, are used to being able to freely do. It gives us a lot more compassion for the people who can't and actually need more of the support that we take for granted. And so even just being willing to open to help was a beautiful experience to watch. I like to be very self-sufficient, with the exception of opening spaghetti jars for whatever, like pasta sauce jars. I can never do it. I might always just hand them to my husband. Hey, babe, you do it. He's like, oh, you didn't even try. I loosened it for you. So being able to ask and being able to receive, these are skills. How many of you listening really hate asking for help? How many of you listening have a hard time receiving help? I actually didn't realize what a hard time I had receiving help until I started to really take in how much help he was willing to receive. Because I think somewhere inside, I connected receiving with, if I receive, something can be taken from me. Trauma, right? Old drama, right? So better not to receive than, because if you receive, you might lose something, even if it's your sense of self. Something will happen if you receive. So we come up with a lot of stories, and so that was one of mine. And watching him transform that way was beautiful. Also seeing him forgive himself. We go through lives, we make mistakes, big lives. When you're in your 70s, you've had a lot of life. There's things that you wish you could do differently, but you couldn't change. Here you are, you're dying. What are you going to do? You're going to take it with you and be in suffering through the end, or am I going to start to radically befriend myself and forgive myself? Because I knew I was doing the best that I can with the tools and skills that I had at the time. Every single one of us is redeemable. And so as that relationship started to develop, what I also saw was an easing of his anxiety, right? Less anxiety, more peace, more presence, more, being with what is, and still being able to enjoy the day for as long as he could.
And do you feel like at this point now, learning that lesson of ease and being less anxious, you've been able to take that into your own life now that time has passed and you've learned that lesson?
Yes and no. There are days when I do it well, and there's days I completely forget that that's possible.
What are some of the other important lessons he shared with you before he passed?
He had a lot of great sayings. I'll share a few of them because I think they'll help somebody out there. One is, he always said to me, do the hard thing first. Tackle the hard thing first. Get it behind you. Put it in the rear view, get it done. And if you think about it, how many of us, like we dangle around the low-hanging fruit. We like, oh, let's just like take little bites. We won't want to do that big thing because that's going to take too much time. And maybe there's some like emotional baggage around it. He just believed in ripping the Band-Aid off and getting it done. And when I do that, I feel so much better. So do the hard thing first. He always believed in saying, I love you. If you feel it, you say it, because time is too short. And some of you out there might be like, oh God, I do feel that, but I just don't say it because it's uncomfortable. And be surprised what happens when you say to somebody, I love you. And more often than not, it just melts their heart, it melts yours. And they might say, I love you too. And that's a really good feeling. We talked about make your golden years now. And one of the other things that was very funny, and again, there's a lot of sayings in the book, but one of the things that was very funny along the lines of making your golden years now is he told me to stop and smell the lizards. And at the time we were living in Florida, and he meant roses, but the medications had scrambled his metaphors. So he was like, remember to stop and smell the lizards. And so I leave everybody at the end of the book with, make time to stop and smell the lizards.
I love that I love you one, where for whatever reason, it can seem so challenging at the time to say something so simple, but just going for it.
Yeah.
And for him was a lot of these lessons he was sharing with you ways he had lived throughout his life before cancer, or was it more things that were coming to the surface since the diagnosis?
I think it was a bit of both. And then things rapidly came to the surface after then. But he's always the person. He's a very kind human being and always a very caring friend to everybody in his life. And so I think all of the sweetness that was him was just bloomed. And then the other parts that he personally chose to heal, he was able to put attention on. And the book itself is really about, we're all going to go through these experiences, as I said in the beginning. And I think one of the reasons, aside from the example that I shared, like, hey, listen, don't beat yourself up. There's a reason why these are emotions we don't want to go near, right? They're hardwired in our DNA not to go near stuff that's scary. But what I have learned is the more we're willing to do that, the more fully alive we can feel and be in our relationships, the realer they get. And I think that that's very fulfilling in a lot of ways. And so we live in a grief-phobic, messy, emotions-averse society. And if you are listening to this interview, or if you can remember a time, or maybe there's a time in the future where you're feeling ill-equipped, you're not the only one. My whole intention behind writing this is to normalize these emotions and to help people navigate them and to help people understand some of the emotions and experiences that may come up when we find ourselves in this place of rupture, so that you don't feel like, what the hell happened to me? Who am I? How am I ever going to get through this? And then you try to avoid and push, and then it comes out in destructive ways, as opposed to saying, I'm going to surrender to this process. Not give up, but I'm going to surrender to this process and be willing to go through it, because the way out is through. That's why it's a very classic spiritual statement throughout space and time. And yet we humans want to be like, oh, hell no. So hopefully some of the things that I've written about will give some people not only some tools, but some comfort along the way.
I definitely feel that normalization piece. And I was going to bring that up before you did. The fact that your book just really connects to a lot of the deeper things in life that aren't talked about and makes it feel more normal, which is just so powerful in and of itself.
Thank you. Yeah. So I set 2 intentions with this book, and the first intention was for you, Jesse. It was for you. It's for anybody willing to read the book. It was for the people who need to read the book, but maybe are afraid to read a book like this. It's just that you're okay. And I'm here to help with my stories and observations, make you feel less alone and give you some new tools to help you cope. And then the intention I set for myself was to push myself further with my writing. I love the process of writing. Writing is probably my biggest joy, and I teach, I coach, I am a keynote speaker, I host workshops and retreats, and I do all of these amazing, fun things. But my heart is my writing. And to be able to push myself further with my storytelling, with teaching through story, having useful resources still, but teaching through story and being willing to go to very vulnerable places that feel uncomfortable for me. Like, are you really going to tell that story? Like, are you really going to say that? Are you really going to bring that amount of humor into such a, to some heavy topic? And if I couldn't do those things creatively, I don't know that I would have done this project, because it took 3 years to do. It took a lot of research and a lot of soul searching and a lot of writing, Jesse. 17 drafts.
Well, it is beautifully written. I read a lot of books for what I do, and your book had me wanting to come back for more and see what was going to happen next. And just the realness, the vulnerability, the humanity of your story and the way you shared it is going to connect with people. And it's just so powerful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I take that. I receive.
One of the emotions I want to talk about that comes up in the book is anger, because this one has a little bit more to it than some of the others. You talk about how when somebody's experiencing this, there's likely an underlying layer. So I'll have you explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the one emotion that I struggled with. I mean, I wrote this chapter probably the most. I did work in this chapter more than any other chapter in the book, including some of the most tender chapters that I found myself in tears writing. And that is because I judged my own anger, and I was very hard on myself about my anger. And we talked about, I don't know if I shared this with you, but one of the things you'll recall from the book is my therapist also said, when the grief train pulls into the station, it brings all the cars. It brings cars you thought you were over. It brings past wounds, past griefs, past losses that, wait, I'm still feeling that? Or maybe you're feeling that, but here it is. It's all up. But it's not just that the grief train brings past grief. It brings anger. It brings jealousy. It brings hopelessness. It brings guilt. It brings shame. It brings big emotions. That's why it's in the subtitle, those messy emotions that feel so life-threatening sometimes. Like we're going to fall apart or be completely out of control. And that's how I felt around anger, because anger was always my go-to protector. And what I remember, I write about this in the book, but my grandmother had a saying about, don't do that because it's unbecoming, right? This emotion's unbecoming, this behavior's unbecoming. And, you internalize those messages. And so for me, one of the big ones that she said was like, don't show sadness, don't cry, and don't show anger, right? They're unbecoming for ladies. So we know that when we push something down, you better believe it's going to come out. And it comes out either as full-blown rage or it's going to come out in other ways. And I had no idea how angry I was, not just at, the fact that my father was dying and I felt like my time was cut short, but old stuff that was coming up for me. And when I was doing my work in therapy, but also researching the book, there's a lot of great research about how anger is often considered a signaling emotion, which is what you were referring to. Researchers at the Gottman Institute talk about an anger iceberg. And so the tip of the iceberg might seem like pretty big, but what we realize is most of the iceberg is underneath the surface. And so anger is your protector. Anger is the signaling emotion. Anger is basically a response to injustice, to threat, to something hurting. Anger says, ow, right? And it's designed to, of course, what? Keep you safe. Now, can it get out of control? Can it come out in all these ways that are difficult for us and others? Of course. But at its core, anger is not something that's bad or wrong in any way, shape, or form. If anything, it's there to tell us something. It says, pay attention to me. And so I had to do a lot of reframing around that. And it's why I write about it, because I think that a lot of people are surprised in loss, in a life-changing rupture, in the shit hitting the fan, some of these other big emotions that may come up. And again, super normal, right?
And whether it be anger, whether it be anywhere along the emotional spectrum, what's the best way, as somebody who's gone through so many different emotions over these last number of years, how do people best process that and not just push things away when the emotions come up?
I mean, that's a very great question. I think specifically with anger, we think about anger can sometimes give us the illusion of power. And certain emotions like grief feel very powerless. And so none of us want to feel powerless. So in some ways, we can lean on anger more. And if you find yourself in that place, it comes back to what we talked about earlier. First of all, therapy can be helpful, but also awareness. So a big part of this journey is about emotional literacy. Sometimes we have all these different feelings and we have no idea what they are, and we feel them all at once, and we don't stop long enough to say, what is this feeling I'm feeling? I just feel energy and emotion, but I don't know what it is. How many times have you been asked, how are you feeling? And you just say, I don't know, right? But if we slow it down enough, we can start to dissect it and figure it out, what it is I'm feeling. And then we can learn more about that emotion. Because that emotion is information, that's all it is. It's there to tell you something so that you can help yourself. That's what it's there to do. And so I say, breathe. Always start with a breath. Whenever the shit goes down, take a deep breath. And then if you can, search yourself. Call it out. Name it. What is this thing that I'm feeling? What is it? Because again, there's information there. And what I also like to do is just kind of insert a gap between what you're feeling and what you're going to do next. You know what I mean? Insert a gap there. It could be through the breath work. It could be through just taking a walk. There's a reason why people say don't ever make a big decision or don't respond to something you're angry about that night, right? Sleep on it, because you might regret what you say. Yeah, take that. And then the next day you wake up and you're like, oh God, I can't believe I did that. Right? So we insert that gap before we actually take action. And those are some things that have helped me. There's a lot of tools out there, but I think if we just come back to the idea of emotional literacy and understanding what it is that we're feeling, understanding that emotion a little bit more, and being willing to work with that emotion, we're going to grow in ways that we can't imagine. It's much better than staying on checked out.
I want to take some time and really talk about grief. And in your book, you divide grief into two different parts, anticipatory and grief. So let's start with the earlier, anticipatory. This is something until reading your book I wasn't aware of, but it made a lot of sense when you gave the example of being at a dinner with your dad and knowing he was going to be passing, and you're getting caught up in your thoughts while you're having this dinner about about that. So talk more about that experience and how we can get caught up in grief even before it's quote unquote time to grieve.
Yeah. Well, like you, Jesse, I had no idea that there was such thing as anticipatory grief. So grief happens long before loss. You know, when you're going to go through a big breakup, when the relationship's falling apart and you are still together with that person and you are finding yourself in anticipatory grief because there's some part of your body that knows where this is going, right? So anticipatory loss isn't just for death. And I think one of the things that will happen is because we're not aware of it, we start to judge ourselves. We start to feel really bad about ourselves. If you're like me at the time, I actually even started to be like, if I think about this, I feel so freaking guilty. But if I think about this, will I be like manifesting his early demise, right? Because your thoughts become your reality. And there's a lot to manifesting, but I was not going to manifest his early demise. But here I am afraid to have those thoughts, feeling bad about myself that I was sitting with him and imagining and talking to him and imagining a year from now, you won't be there. And so are you going to change it? Are we going to amputate it? Is it, you're never going to feel it? No, it's just like, oh, and this too. Oh, and this is part of the process too. Oh, this is what my brain does when it's preparing for loss. Oh, this is a new emotion. This is a new feeling. I didn't know about it. Here we go. Instead of running from it and all the other things we've talked about. There's lots of forms of grief. And again, I'm not a grief expert. There's complicated grief. There's many, many ways that grief manifests. Grief manifests in our body. There's symptoms of grief, from fatigue to foggy thinking to, I talk about this in the book, Jesse, you may have had this experience where you can't find your keys and you're like, where are my damn keys? You're thinking, where's my memory? But I remember the day that I couldn't find my car, and I've had the same car for 12 years because I didn't remember what my car looked like. The gray car you've had for 12 years? Is it a red car that I drive? I don't know. And I thought, oh my gosh, and I said all the bad things to myself. And then I stopped and I said, this is what grief looks like. You don't know what color your car is. And so I just wanted to say that there's lots of forms of grief, but the experience that we have is universal, which is there's no timeline for it. There's no beginning, middle, and end. There's no stages. There's orbits. There's no right or wrong way to handle grief. There's no roadmap. But there is life that we can create around that emotion. Like, I'm never going to not grieve my father. I'd like for him to be here right now. But I'm building new memories and new joy and memories about him. Even being able to talk about this with you. My father still lives. In this interview, there's something I said about him that will impact somebody else, that will impact their children. Some small thing, make your golden years now, that will become a family motto somewhere. And so I'm building new experiences around heartache. And I didn't know that I could do that. I didn't know grief would give me that opportunity, but it does.
And the way you talked about grief there, the way it's never ending and it sounds like it's very gray. But as somebody who's relatively recently went through, the grieving process and is still going through, again, it never ends. But your father's passing a few years ago. And because we're all human, we're all going to have major ruptures, deaths in our life and major events. What would you say to the person who's in the middle of a shitstorm? We keep bringing that up during our conversation, but of grief right now, and they're just feeling like there's no end in sight. This is my new normal, and life is just totally coming down on me. What would you say to that person?
Well, there's nothing I can say to make it better. There's no tip. I've given some things along the way in this beautiful interview. It's not my job to take the pain away. First thing I would say is, I'm so sorry you're going through this, sweetheart. And this is hard stuff. I don't want to minimize it in any way, shape, or form. This is the hardest stuff in the human experience. And here you are finding yourself at the heart of it. And I don't know what it is that you're grieving. I can never understand that. I have my experiences of grief, but I won't co-opt yours. But what I can say that has helped me is asking for support sooner than I think I need it, because we're not meant to do this alone. We need each other. And so I know what my support system looks like, and I want to encourage you to develop your own, because this thing that we're experiencing can be very lonely, and it can also be very life affirming in some ways. It does change us. We will never be the same, and that's not always such a bad thing. So find your support and don't isolate.
In tying into that, I'd have to imagine going through a life event like the passing of a parent, one of the great challenges would be going on about the other things in your life. We talked about this a bit before with business and with other relationships. And I can imagine, this being so all encompassing, the passing of a parent. And luckily, I knock on wood, I haven't been through that yet. But what advice would you give to somebody who's trying to balance kids and a dog and a job and all the things that we all do day in, day out, which are already filling our 24 hours? But then we have this on top of it, and we're grieving. And again, I'm coming to you as somebody who's relatively recently been through it. How do we give ourselves the space for it? And then as somebody who's a loved one, how do we help them during that time? I can imagine time becomes ever so tight.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of the things. I'm not going to repeat, but yeah, I will. Asking for help, receiving, getting support. We can't do this alone. Don't be a superhero. Take off the damn cape. No, I've got this. Let me double down. No, I'll get the kids. No, I'll make the dinner. No, I'll make sure the nurse is there. No, I'll do this. No, I'll do that. Now you're just being a martyr. Stop. Honestly, get support. Be willing to say, hey, we got to share this load somehow. And, not everybody can do all the things we need them to do, but there are little things that we can ask for. And sometimes it just means taking a step back and organizing yourself a little bit. Because if we're in it, we're just I don't know if you've ever said this, Jesse, but I have said this, and it is my demise in life and in business. Next time I see you, I want you to ask me if I've changed this naughty thing, right? It'll be faster if I do it myself. No. It's just faster if I do it myself. No, I know how to do it. It's just, it's harder to even just tell somebody what to do and break it down. It's faster if I do it myself.
I say it.
Yeah. It's those behaviors that we have to say, of course, it's faster if you do it yourself because you've done it for 87 years and you do it well. But is this the best use of your time at this critical time in life? Is this even if you think about your business, is this the highest use of you? The ROI of you getting on a podcast lifts your business so much higher than if you do something in the weeds because you're good at doing it. And so it's a mindset shift, and then it's an actual behavioral shift. And it's the same thing with, I think, caregiving in the storm, let's call it. The other thing that I would say is I share this with my community a lot, and I do this for myself when I'm stretched way too thin and knowing I need to give more to the places that I intentionally want to give, or maybe not more, but there's in places that I intentionally want to give, and yet here I find myself stretched so thin. Lower the bar on your standards. Lower the bar. Good enough is good enough. If you're like me, you want to take it that next 10%. No. Let me look at that one more time. I want to make one more tweak to that. Good enough is good enough. No. It doesn't. God, if I don't do the hour-long soul cycle spin thing, if I don't do the hour long, it's not good enough. And then you don't do the 10-minute HIIT class that you can do on your phone with the video membership that you're on. You know what I mean? Like you don't even move at all because you couldn't do the hour long. So it's like lowering the standards because we can't hold ourselves to the highest standard that's impossible. Well, first of all, we shouldn't do that, period. But secondly, especially when we're holding the weight of the world as well. Good enough is good enough.
Well, the challenging thing about what you just said there, good enough is good enough, is that it's so self-reinforcing when you do push it to quote unquote perfection, and then you achieve the success like you have, where you've seen that work for you and brought you to this certain level. So you've been reinforced over time that works. So you have to kind of undo that and push against that as well.
100%. I'm my own worst enemy. Why do you think I can write these things? Yeah, absolutely. But then I have to look back on times in my life where my success might have been at the pinnacle, but inside I was feeling not very healthy, not very happy. And so I know I can be prone to chronic anxiety. And when I'm stretched too thin, even if success is on fire, I need to think about that. What's more important to me, so-called success or feeling comfortable and good in my skin? So it's a balancing act. There is no right answer to this stuff. It's like, what's the dance that you need to do?
Kris, you share the story in your book of your dad's transition and your mom and you were with him. And I believe you guys lit candles and your mom had her hand on his heart and you were holding his hand. It was, obviously a super sad moment, but it was a beautiful, beautiful transition. The way you guys were all together and the love, I could feel the love through the story. I know we're coming up on time here, but we'll end on this. Going through your father's passing, how has that changed the relationship with your mom and your husband, the people closest to you? As you guys saw each other emotionally and in the rawness and the vulnerability during the toughest times, how has that changed those relationships?
Deep in them. We've never been closer. Healed a lot of parts and a lot of, old wounds, but not because it just happened, but because we were willing to do a lot of work with each other. And I speak specifically of me and my mom, willing to have difficult conversations, willing to stay in the mud when this pain comes up, willing to hear each other, willing to love each other through the hard times and find a deeper, real friendship with ourselves, 2.5 years after my dad's passing. And so, seeing how my mom showed up for my dad, and also the kind of, I write about this in this specific chapter in the book of how she was at his bedside as he was passing. It forever changed my understanding of how much capacity she has for love. Like, it's incredible. And I think each of us have it, but we have wounds and we have barnacles and we have protective mechanisms and we have insecurities and we have all of these things that we as humans struggle with. And as we're able to thaw those and remove those or soften them, I feel like we have that ability to let love flow through us like the channel that it is meant to be. It's the blockages that bring us to a place where we don't find and feel the joy. It's the same thing with our health. When our energy is flowing, we feel well, right? When we start to have blockages in our well-being, we don't feel well. So we find the blockages and we do what we can to soften them, to ease them, to make them a little easier to manage. And I feel like that's the exact same thing we can do with love. That's what I've seen as a result of this. And it's an ongoing process, right?
It all is. Kris, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your story, sharing it through the book. Again, it's a fantastic read and it's just so raw and real, and people are really going to connect with this story. Thank you for coming on and sharing all your wisdom and stories today. This was a lot of fun to converse with you, and we're going to link up the book. We're going to link up your social media, everything in the show notes. And I just want to say thank you again. This was beautiful.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for conducting such a beautiful experience with me. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Thank you, Kris. Now that you're done my conversation with Kris, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Julie. She'll teach you how to control your mind. I'll see you over there.
So you can experience that wash of emotion as an experience, not who I am. It doesn't mean I'm unable to cope. It's just a wash of anxiety. And then I'm